This video is part 2 of my JavaScript interview questions series. Welcome to my YouTube channel where I simplify the web. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet of this series, you can check the video description below. I'm going to leave a link to it. In part 1, I shared and answered 5 JavaScript questions, and I'll be doing the same thing here again in part 2. I'll be sharing and answering 5 JavaScript questions that can be asked in interviews and can also improve your JavaScript knowledge. So let's jump straight to the 5 questions I have for you today. The first question I have here is, what does the scope of a variable mean in JavaScript? When variables are created, they have an environment, and that environment is the only area such variables can be accessed or referenced. Other parts of the code outside the environment cannot access that code. This environment is called the variable's scope. The scope of a variable determines its accessibility by different parts of your code. I'll use this simple example here to explain what scope means here. So here I have 3 variables. I have variable 1, variable 2, and variable 3. This is variable 1 here, which means everything here inside this function, everything here can access this variable. So if I try to console.log variable 1 inside this function and also console.log variable 1 inside this other function, if I come here and I run this file, you can see it works because this function is in the same environment that this variable 1 is. So everything inside this function will be able to access variable 1. As for variable 2 is declared inside this print function. That means only parts of the code that are inside this function can access variable 2, which means inside here in this second function that is inside the print function, I can access variable 2. If I come here and run it, you can see I can access variable 2. But if I try to access variable 2 outside the print function, if I run this is going to throw an error. Variable 2 is not defined. The reason for this is because variable 2 is declared inside this function, and since this part of the code here is outside this function, we cannot access variable 2. And the same thing for variable 3. I'm declaring variable 3 inside this another print function, but if I try to access it outside the another print function, let's say I try to access it in the print function but outside the another print function, we also have this error. If I run this, you see again variable 3 is not defined. That's because the scope of this variable is only for inside this function, so only things inside the another print function can access variable 3. So like I said, the scope of a variable determines its accessibility by different parts of the code. Second question, explain the different types of variable scope that we have in JavaScript. In JavaScript, we have 3 types of scope. Number 1 is the global scope, which is for variables defined outside of functions. This makes such variables accessible everywhere, that is in all parts of your code. Local scope, which is the second type, is for variables defined inside functions, which makes the variable only accessible inside the function. While block scope, which was introduced in ES6, is for variables that are assigned with let or const inside a block, and a block is represented by curly braces. So such variables can be inside if statements, because if statements have curly braces, loop statements have curly braces. Whatever involves curly braces creates a block scope, and such variables can only be accessible in that block. Coming back to our example here, we can see that variable 1 is in the global scope because it is outside a function, which means you can access variable 1 inside print, inside another print. You can access it in many other places of this program. Local scope, like I said, is for variables declared inside a function. So this variable 2 is inside a local scope of this print function. This variable 3 is inside a local scope of this another print function. Then what about block scope? Let's say we have an if statement here that says if true, then here we declare a variable. You can use let, you can use const. So let's say variable 4 is equals to variable 4. Now this variable 4 now has a block scope. It is not a global scope, but it is a block scope, which means if you try to access variable 4 outside this block scope, you're also going to get an error. As you can see here, variable 4 is not defined. Same thing if you are using loop statement. Like I said, whatever involves curly braces like this, opening and closing curly brace, whatever variable you declare inside with let or const is going to be in block scope. But if you use var, this is just going to be a global variable. So we can try to access variable 4. You can see this is variable 4. So with var, you cannot create block scopes. You can only create block scopes with let and const. The third question is share 4 rules for naming variables in JavaScript. Number 1, a variable name cannot begin with a number. It can only begin with a letter, an underscore, or a $sign. Number 2, you cannot include special characters in your variable names. Only the $sign and the underscore are the special characters that are allowed. Number 3, variable names cannot be a keyword, so you cannot name a variable if, const, switch, or other keywords in JavaScript. And number 4, variable names are case sensitive, so animal and animal are 2 different variables in JavaScript. The fourth question, what is a callback in JavaScript? Functions receive different data types as arguments. This argument could be a number, it could be a string, it could be an array, or it could even be a function. A function, say function A, that is passed as an argument to another function, say function B, is called a callback function. And this makes it possible for function B to call function A whenever it likes. So I have this simple example here. You can see this is function A. All it does is console log I am function A. And then we have function B, and in this function B we receive a callback function, and then here we console log I am function B, then we console log about to call a callback, and then we execute the callback. Now in function B here you can see we are passing this function A. If I run this file, see what happens. So you have I am function B, which is this line, then you have about to call a callback, which is this line, and then when you execute this callback here, which is this function A here, you can see we now have I am function A. What makes callbacks beautiful is that function B can choose to call this callback whenever it likes. So for example, I can set a timeout here, and in this timeout I can move this callback here, and then I can say execute this after 2 seconds. So if I come here, clear the console, and I run no test, you can see I am function B and about to call a callback executed, and after 2 seconds it executes callback. So callback functions makes it possible for this function, which is called a higher order function, to execute this callback whenever it likes. And for the last but not the least question, what is the difference between local storage and session storage in JavaScript? Local storage and session storage are 2 ways of storing data on the browser storage for different domains, and they have the same syntax for adding, updating, retrieving, and deleting such data. But the difference is that local storage does not have an expiry for the data it saves. So when you store a data with local storage, the data would only expire when you manually delete it. But session storage has an expiry period for the data that it stores, and such data expires when the page session ends. A session ending means that the page tab is closed or that the browser is closed. Like I mentioned in part 1, I'll be leaving relevant links to previous videos that I've made that are dedicated to each of these questions in the video description. So check the video description if you'd love to understand any of these questions better. If you enjoyed this video again, please share with others, like it, subscribe, and also turn on notifications for more parts I'll be making in this series.